Hey guys, it's your boy, Ballface 8020, back again with another great commentary. I wanted to talk, about the just some economic stuff because we can all feel it. We all know that the bottom is going to drop out of this bullshit fake economy really soon. I would say 7 to 14 weeks, but I don't know. Just not enough new data to say. So I wouldn't be surprised if I only get to talk about economics one more time before the crash finally happens. Um, but I did want to follow up on my 80's, 90's video and stuff about boredom. There was some good stuff made in the comments, some stuff I forgot to mention in the video, and I just wanted to follow up with it. Um, First thing I would say is, and then I don't know if I really made this point clear in the 80's and 90's. Like, it wasn't really just the technology per se that made things better. It's just that the real difference in the 80's and 90's and between 80's and 90's, well, there was a lot of differences, but the real differences in American culture, and particularly not even American culture, although that was different too. That's too broad. Pop culture. Um, the pop culture in the 80's and 90's versus today, or even 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is that pop culture in the 80's and 90's just had so much more substance. And you can really go back to a lot of movies in the 80's and 90's and the television shows too, and see them and know that they could nothing like them could be made again today. And not in the senses because like they wouldn't be politically acceptable, but just because that there was too much substance there, and it wasn't like, but um, I'm gonna try not to get too waylaid here, but like I really enjoy step back a little bit further. When I was young, the video game system that I grew up on was the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, and at the time, as a kid, I loved almost all the games. I would rent a new game each weekend, and I'd be able to play it the whole weekend, and leave the weekend wanting more. Um, Now, there were some games that were better than others, some that I really didn't like. They were also very confusing and hard to figure out what to do. Um, but when I go back today as an adult, um, the ones that hold up are phenomenal. They're still better than I think anything you can play today, although I know I'm not really the target market. And the ones that don't hold up, though, pretty much suck. And that's the overwhelming majority of the games. And it's kind of like that with movies and stuff from the 80's and 90's. Now, most of that stuff doesn't hold up. Most of the pop culture from the 80's and 90's doesn't hold up. Although I would say the crap that doesn't hold up from the 80's and 90's is still better than the crap that just comes out today. And even even if you like superheroes, even the good superhero movies today, which there are none because superhero movies are stupid. But the most recent one I saw was, I don't know if it was the most recent Batman or Batman. It was the last one with Christian Bale, whenever that was. So I don't know if that was like 2012 or whatever, or 2011. It might actually be the last movie I've seen in a theater. Period. Uh, Movie was, it was okay, but it was nothing like the huge event seeing Batman 2 in theaters was, which I remember. Batman, I think it was called Batman Returns, with Michael Keaton, Michelle Pfeiffer, Danny DeVito, Christopher Walken. I don't know who else. Great movie. Today I wouldn't like it because I hate superhero movies. But at the time, like, even I think if you control for time, you still get something that's like had a lot more substance, was just a lot better. Um, One thing you could say is that the things just had more soul back then. There was more originality and more soul. I think that's like the biggest difference. And the 80's and 90's, there was just as much substance or soul as there had been in the 60's or 70's. 50's is a little harder to compare it to because it was kind of, post-war, culture was still kind of getting its feet together. Don't get me wrong, I watch stuff from the 50's and feel nostalgic for the 50's when I was never there. So I'm sure there were some things that were better about the 50's too. but there was but really like I think like I said I think with the 80s and 90s you had the best combination of technological and social advancement um that you didn't have in like so much in the 50s and to a lesser extent the 60s. um the peak of technological, social and creative advancement even. But you didn't have like past those times, you had things continued to progress, but in a way that overall made things worse. And the so I know that a lot of this is redundant, but I just wanted to make that thing clear about the differences. It wasn't just the technology; it's more that the technology, I think, and that's going to be my next point. The technology kind of is a factor. Like I mean, is a like I think that the technology may be part of the reason why things have less soul. One thing I just want to do talk more about on the substance and stuff is there was also just a different mood in the country, and this might be related to technology too. If you weren't really there in the 80s and 90s and you don't remember it, social mood affects you. Social mood is something you don't think about, but you can feel like the mood in when you're just out. You can just feel the mood of the country and whatever, which is why I expected. Well, that's not. I'm not going to lie and say that I predicted that Trump would win in 2016. There were times where I thought he would, and times where I thought he wouldn't. But what I could feel was the discontent in the air. You could just feel it, and the and that's which opened the door for a candidate like Trump. But anyway, what I'm talking about is you can feel, social mood and stuff. Like you can feel the social mood today, which is very pessimistic, extremely negative and stuff. It's almost the exact opposite of the 80s and 90s, which was insanely optimistic because I don't remember the 70s. The 60s were crazy too. And the 50s were probably kind of optimistic in a more calm way. But the 80s and 90s, it was super optimistic. And it was super optimistic and it was a cheerful time. Not saying there weren't people who were depressed and suffering in the 80s and 90s. Of course they were. But I'm talking society as a whole, cultural as a whole. There was a happy vibe in the air. And that needs to be taken into account too. Now, like I said in the previous video, that could never have lasted anyway. There were a lot of things that go into it. But this goes back into what I wanted to talk about boredom in general. I had some people in the comments in the last video mention, yeah, I mean, things may have been better then, or like I don't really remember it, but or I do remember it, but I couldn't give up the I can't imagine how boring things were, or I remember how boring things were and it sucked. And again, I want to stress again, I remember being bored a lot back then. So like that was definitely an issue. That was definitely an issue, but it made me think, about boredom. And the just like, technology, which is good, has caused us to lose things that were pretty cool, like newspapers, let's see, newspapers, comic books, bookstores, video stores, especially arcades. Remember how fun? I know you probably don't because you're too young. But before, like you could have any type of game you wanted at home. Arcades were super cool. So just like technology caused us to lose some things that were really good, I think lack of boredom also caused us to lose things that were really good. Because yes, I do remember being bored a lot as a kid. That's true. And it wasn't always like I didn't have anybody else around, although I wasn't much of an athlete. It wasn't that cool. The kids I hung out with, not very cool, not very athletic either. Maybe if we had been like in Southern California or something, we'd have found more fun stuff to do. But us being, there's a couple things. One is us being bored forced us to find stuff to do. like find fun ways to kill the time. And which today you don't need to do. You just plug in, plug in and tune out. And the other thing is that I think boredom itself might have some kind of therapeutic effects. And I've been reading about this. There's like neurologically, they say boredom is actually good for the brain. And remember, boredom shouldn't even be a negative sensation. It should be a neutral sensation. It's just you're so used to your mind being stimulated that you interpret it as boredom. So, my feeling is that as society has progressed, we've become more and more bored because we've gotten, our minds more used to like constant stimulation. Like somebody who just is doing farm work every day, like in medieval England, they probably didn't get that bored because they were just used to never having anything interesting to do anyway. And that kind of gets to back to what I said about I think the 80s and 90s kind of being the sweet spot in that, because we still had enough time that forced us to kind of, decompress and decompress and recharge. And yeah, it was unpleasant and boring, but even though we felt it as unpleasant and boring, it was good for us. It made us happier, and it made it so we weren't as numb to pleasure. So we could really go and have fun in a way we can't have fun today. You could go out and play, football or ride bikes with your friends for hours, as a kid, and have like a ton of fun, more fun than we could ever have today. And you can't have that kind of fun now. I know because, we're older, but even if you were a kid, I don't know if you could have that same level of fun now because your dopamine receptors are shot to shit from the nonstop stimulation. And I think that went for everybody. So like, yeah, you had time where you were just sitting around with nothing to do. And, you found stuff. You found stuff to told you over. Maybe you read something. Maybe you flip channels through the TV, although you generally stay away from that. Maybe you just sit there and be bored. Maybe you go out and do some exercise or do some chores, do stuff like that. But you made it work. You always found something, because I tell you what, even though I do remember there being a lot of times where I was super bored, I also remember it not being like all the time, which is how I would feel now. Because I've had days where I didn't have like internet connection or whatever. And I'm just like incredibly bored out of my mind. I don't want to say way worse than it was back then, but it's more traumatic now because I'm not as used to it. And it just goes on until I have the internet back. I'm just completely useless without it. And obviously it wasn't like that back in the day. So, yeah, and that's, I think that's one thing that Buddhists and Stoics really do get right. And I'm not saying that means that we should stop using these things. I'm only just saying it as I'm saying that there are bad things that come with it. And yeah, honestly, you probably would be better off if you as an individual, probably would better off. I don't know if like just never using the internet or social media or whatever you probably should never use social media because there's nothing there. But you probably if you restricted like your internet use to like an as needed basis, I don't know where you would get the self-discipline to do that. But if you did, you always see these things on like YouTube about it. Like, oh yeah, my productivity went way up. It's like, dude, who fucking cares? I don't give a shit about my productivity. But I think you'd be happier. I think that there's a few things that cause the increase in depression, and that we've been seeing over these, especially over the last 10 to 20 years, but really it's been going on last 50 years at least. And I think it's because the human mind isn't built to really handle, the human brain isn't built to handle modernity. I think that's one of the big things. The more stimulation, I think, is causing a lot of depression, or making it worse at least. And the other thing I think is actually a nutritional thing. I think that that we're not undernourished. We're getting enough calories, but we're not getting all the nutrients, and our guts aren't getting the right, flora that they need or whatever, or they're not getting enough probiotics they need. Because that's, depression starts in your gut, not in your brain. It starts in although I guess it could start in your brain, but often it starts in your gut. And, we just don't have the same, microbiome or whatever you want to call it. Stuff like that. And we eat a lot of foods that are inflammatory, including in our brains, and that, makes us more depressed as well. So, yeah. All right. That's all for now, and I'll see you in the next.